Hello History Haulers, and welcome back to History Haul YouTube, your historical home on the internet. Now, today I want to talk about one of the creepier stories that I know from British history. It's a story which has spawned hundreds of theories, conspiracy theories, paranormal theories, and it's never been conclusively solved, this mystery, although we do now know what we think probably happened. That final piece of evidence to prove it has never been found. So join me today as we disappear down the rabbit hole of the disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst. Now, Benjamin Bathurst had just about everything you needed to make it in late 18th century, early 19th century British society. He was born into a family of wealth. He was born into a family of note. There was a certain level of fame associated with his family. His father was a senior member of the church, a very senior member of the Church of England. And he had the good looks of the family. He had the money behind him. The family had connections. If you were going to be born or choose to be born into any family that wasn't royalty at the time, this is the sort of family that you would want to have been born into. Now, Benjamin's father, Henry Bathurst, was the Bishop of Norwich, one of the most senior prelates of the Church of England. He was a Lord Spiritual, meaning that he not only had power within the church, but he was a member of the House of Lords as well, with attendant responsibilities around the royal court. And so this was a family of real societal note. His sister Caroline ended up going on to become a very famous poetess of her generation as well. But it really would be Benjamin who would stick the family's name onto the chatboard, if you like, of history, because he would not only go on to become famous in his own lifetime, but infamous as well. And that infamy had more to do with not how he lived, but how he died. Now, like I say, this chap was always going to do well in life because the family had connections, and as soon as the boy was old enough, he was educated and he was looking for a career, one of his relatives found him a pretty cushy job within the diplomatic service. And soon he found himself promoted to the considerably important position of secretary to the British legation at Livorno in the what was then Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Now, while this was an important job, it wasn't quite as important as the job he was promoted to following his time in Tuscany. However, in the meantime, he also found love in the form of a young lady called Philida Call, who was the daughter of another member of the aristocracy, Sir John Call, a Cornish baronet, and this was considered a very good, a very advantageous marriage for both families. So, on the surface of things, prospects were beginning to look pretty bright. But by 1809, things on the continent were beginning to look pretty rough. Napoleon was marauding from country to country, sort of taking over every piece of land that he set foot on, and the British government were worried about this, to say the very least. And so Benjamin was given a promotion. He was dispatched off to Vienna as a diplomatic envoy to the emperor there, who was at the time the Emperor Francis I, and he was expected to try and cajole the emperor into joining the British in their fight against Napoleon. And he had some success. Initially, the Austrian emperor was very open-minded to this idea. He agreed to support the British. An alliance was rebuilt between the two countries, and things looked like they were going to go well for both sides. However, Napoleon had other ideas. He invaded Austria, he invaded Vienna, the royal court had to flee for its life, and that changed everything. The Austrian defeat at the Battle of Wagram in 1809 really sealed the fate of the British-Austrian alliance. The Austrian powers were in no position at all to support anyone at that particular juncture in time, and so the alliance between Britain and Austria was dropped. They sued for peace with Napoleon, and suddenly Benjamin found himself in a Vienna which had become very, very hostile and very dangerous for any British person, let alone a British diplomat, to continue living in. Now, the powers that be back in Britain felt exactly the same way. Benjamin, remaining in Vienna, really was now risking his life. He was in very hostile territory. He could have been arrested simply for being British, but he could also have been arrested specifically for being a British spy, and that put him in real danger. So he was ultimately recalled back to Britain. However, it was still his job to decide how he was going to get back there safely. Now, he didn't have long to come up with a workable plan as to how he and his supporters were going to get out of what had now become enemy territory, but he did eventually decide to go north and to take a boat back to Britain from the city of Hamburg. Now, obviously, he would be travelling through a lot of dangerous territory in doing so, so he had to find an alias for himself, something that would help him to blend into the background, something that would make him unobtrusive, something that would deter people from looking at him and from commenting on him and really from attracting any attention at all. The young Benjamin thought the best way to avoid detection on his travels through enemy territory was to adopt an aristocratic title, and not any aristocratic title, but a German aristocratic title. He called himself Baron von Koch. It's an odd thing to do, given he could barely speak a word of German and had an English accent. However, he was determined to go ahead with this foolproof plan, and so by the 25th of November 1809, he and his assistant were on the road. They were travelling. They'd taken a carriage called a chaise, and they were comfortably settled into their false identities, and they decided to stop off at a town on the way to renew their horses. So they stopped off at the town of Perleberg, just west of Berlin, where they were able to get themselves some new horses and a bit of supper. There was an inn there called the White Swan, and it seemed like the ideal place for Benjamin and his assistant to put their feet up for a bit, do a bit of admin, have some food, refresh themselves before they continued on their journey to Hamburg. Now, we know that Benjamin, as soon as he got to the inn, he ordered himself some food, and he also ordered himself a private room, and he sequestered himself in there for quite some time, writing letters, dealing with correspondence, probably burning some incriminating evidence that he had with him as well, just in case he was stopped by authorities, and basically tidying up loose ends and doing what he needed to do. However, as things often do even to this day, the time that they had been given was incorrect, and things took a lot longer than they were meant to take, and it was 9 o'clock at night before someone came into the inn and told Benjamin that it was time for them to leave. The horses were ready, the carriage was now ready, and they could go on their way. Now, he must have been pretty impatient by this point, because those who witnessed this say that he jumped up almost immediately, threw his things together, and headed striding out of the door towards the carriage. Now, you might be thinking at this point, when does this get weird? When does this get conspiratorial or paranormal? This sounds like a pretty ordinary account of a man trying to get out of enemy territory, taking a very silly alias, but nevertheless an alias, and so far doing reasonably well in getting there. Well, it's at this point that things completely unravel. You see, when Benjamin headed out the door with such gusto, he was followed by his assistant. Now, this assistant, whose name was Herr Klaus, would testify later on that he had seen Bathurst exit the building. He had seen him go around the new horses, and he had seen him disappear into thin air. Because between leaving the inn and heading around the other side of this carriage, around these new horses which had been tethered onto it, and thus began a mystery which has fascinated people in the 2.25 centuries since it happened. Something had happened to him, and to this day we don't entirely know what it was. We simply know that he was there one minute and he wasn't there the next. He didn't get into the carriage on the other side, and when his assistant Herr Klaus went around the other side of the carriage looking for him, there was no sign of him whatsoever. But that furore didn't happen immediately. The people of this area were used to this kind of thing happening. There were bandits, there were robbers. The country had been overrun by a foreign power, so controlling armies were marauding through the countryside as well, and quite frankly, people just disappeared on a semi-regular basis. So at that point, no one was particularly surprised or probably concerned that a complete stranger with a strange British accent to go along with his even stranger German title had disappeared into thin air. And so it was left to Herr Kraus to carry on with their journey alone. He did get to Hamburg. He did take a ship to Britain. He did inform the authorities there that Benjamin Bathurst wasn't with him. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know what had happened to him. And eventually, news reached his father, the Bishop of Norwich. The Foreign Secretary at the time called Henry Bathurst to a meeting at Apsley House where he was told his son had disappeared without a trace. And at that point, things began to happen. But it would be Bathurst's wife, Phillida, who would really get the gears moving in the search for her husband. She immediately took matters into her own hands, and along with a companion who himself was a German explorer, she headed off to Perleberg to do some of her own investigations. Now, when she got there, she found that yes, an investigation had been opened, but it was a pretty half-hearted investigation, to say the very least. The man in charge of that investigation had been working under the assumption that Benjamin had unalived himself, and really it was a formality that this investigation was being carried out at all. But Phillida, she wasn't convinced by that. She wasn't accustomed to taking no for an answer when she wanted something done. So she lobbied the people in charge of this investigation to ramp it up and to begin to look more seriously into what happened to her husband. And as a result of that, rivers were dragged, forests were searched, and finally a coat was found. It was a fur coat, it was an expensive coat, and it was a coat which almost certainly had belonged to Benjamin. Now, it wasn't so much the finding of this coat, but where the coat was found that would prove to be so important in the minds of people who've investigated this, because it was found in the outhouse of a dwelling which belonged to some locals, a family called Schmidt, a family which just so happened to work at the Swan Inn. Then, only a couple of weeks later, when a local forest was being searched, a pair of pantaloons, a sort of trousers of the time, were found discarded as well. Now, there is one report that I have read which has suggested that those pantaloons had a couple of bullet holes in them. I can't find that anywhere else, but nevertheless, it was ascertained that these pantaloons had undoubtedly belonged to Benjamin. So soon the investigation began to centre on this family of Schmidt. It turned out that two of its members worked at the White Swan, the mother of the house and her son, a certain August Schmidt, who himself had been seen that night interacting with Benjamin. One of his fellow employees there would later testify that not only had he been seen interacting with Benjamin, but as soon as Benjamin had stood up to leave when he was told that his horses and his carriage were ready, that August himself had very, very quickly followed him out of the building and into the darkness. She had said to him that he was leaving, his horses were ready, and at that point he had simply walked away from her and followed him out. And she herself testified too that she believed even at the time that he was probably going to murder him. She hadn't thought to mention that to anyone up until this period of time. She didn't think that was an important thing that she'd seen or thought that she'd had. But weirdly, despite that, nobody was charged. Nobody was charged. August wasn't charged, his mother wasn't charged, the woman who had testified against him when she was finally forced to do so, even though she'd known this information the whole time, she wasn't charged. Nobody was charged. There were zero charges. But Phillida was a lady of real metal and substance, and she wasn't going to have this investigation brushed under the carpet. At great expense to herself, she had the area around the town searched and excavated and rivers trawled. She had dogs, trained dogs put out into the woods. Everything she could possibly throw money at that could possibly be done, money was thrown at it. And when that still turned up nothing, she decided to go even further. She was given safe conduct to travel out of Germany and into France. Remember, at this time she was a British subject and Britain and France were at war, but she was given safe conduct into France. She went to Paris, and she forced herself into a meeting with the Emperor Napoleon. This woman was a lady boss. If ever there was a lady boss in history, it was Phillida. She literally went to Paris, the epicenter of enemy territory. She found the most powerful man on earth at that time. She forced him to speak to her, and eventually he agreed to give her any assistance that she needed in looking for her husband, and promised that it was nothing to do with him, that his officers, his men, nobody in his command had done anything to her husband, even though he was an enemy of an enemy force on territory which they had taken over, that he knew nothing about it at all. He must have been terrified of her. I mean, if you're in a pickle, Phillida Bathurst is the kind of woman that you're going to want on your side, put it that way. This Fraulein, ladies and gentlemen, gets Shiza done. Now, a huge reward had been offered for any information on Benjamin's whereabouts, or if anyone had seen anything incriminating, and of course, as these huge rewards often do, it did more harm than good, because suddenly anybody that needed any sum of money at all to pay for whatever it was they needed to pay for was contacting their local authority claiming to have information about the whereabouts of Benjamin Bathurst. Needless to say, none of them were correct. So suddenly, big names were involved in this whole debacle. It became international news. As soon as Napoleon was involved, everybody wanted to talk about it. The Times of London were blaming the French. The French were blaming the British. They were calling each other names. The whole thing became a media circus. The one thing this media circus wasn't doing, ladies and gentlemen, was finding Benjamin Bathurst. And despite her iron resolve, Phillida eventually had to concede defeat. She headed back to continue her life without her husband, and at that point the whole mystery seemed to be completely unsolvable. However, almost 50 years later, in 1852, a body was discovered under the threshold of a barn in a house only about 300 metres from the White Swan Inn. Now, this house had actually belonged to someone at the time of the disappearance who worked at the White Swan Inn, and by 1852 it had been sold to someone else. They were doing some work on this building and they uncovered this skeleton. Now, the skeleton itself showed signs of having been hit on the back of the head with a blunt instrument. There was certainly trauma there. There was also evidence of a tooth having been removed by a dentist, which was a much more serious and considerable thing to have happen in those days than it is now. So it was certainly remarkable to mention that. Benjamin's sister, who by that point in time was living in that part of the world herself and was an accomplished poet, was asked to come and view the skull that had been discovered alongside this body. She did so, but she, I think quite understandably, felt that having not seen her brother for well over 40 years and now being presented with a fleshless skull, she couldn't one way or another bring herself to identify this as having been her disappeared brother. I think it's safe to say he probably looked pretty different the last time she'd seen him. And so without a positive identification, the body was marked as unknown and no further investigation was made into who it had been. And so thus, ladies and gentlemen, the case of Benjamin Bathurst has remained pretty much unsolved ever since. Today, it's believed that, in fact, he was probably the victim of a band of local people who had set about him, had robbed him for his clothes, for his money, and had disposed of the body. Bathurst wasn't someone to hide his wealth. He had travelled like a member of minor royalty. He called himself a baron. Everything about him had suggested money, and he was travelling through areas of the world which at the time were very poor, where lawlessness was pretty much the norm, and given that an invading army had taken over that country at the time, the level of lawlessness was even higher than it had normally been. And so we now think that yes, he was probably attacked. He was probably attacked by people who worked at the inn where he had been staying that day. There are reports that he had been ostentatiously counting his money in front of the fire, in front of all of these people who were scratching a living off the land at the time. And so I don't think it requires a great leap of the imagination to see how some of these very, very poor people, knowing that the consequences would likely be non-existent, took matters into their own hands and reappropriated that wealth to themselves. But that, of course, ladies and gentlemen, hasn't stopped the rumour mills from turning over the years. People have embellished this story in the last couple of centuries out of all proportion. There's suggestions that he had walked into a portal of some kind and just disappeared that way. There are suggestions that he had been taken by aliens in the split second between going out of sight and reaching the side of the carriage. There are all sorts of theories and suggestions, some of them wacky, some of them more credible, have appeared over the years. But the truth is that Bathurst was probably just attacked by a whole load of thugs who wanted his money, who wanted his clothes, and were prepared to do anything they had to do to get them. But he has become a staple of the fantasy and science fiction novel genre over the years. Benjamin has appeared in countless books that have revolved around his disappearance, and that's been woven into the narratives of the fiction. And what that has done, like it's done with so many other of these sort of events in the past, is it's created a mythology around the disappearance of this man that has taken it from the everyday and mundane, albeit criminal act, into the world of the fantasy of the supernatural. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the chilling, officially unsolved mystery of the disappearance of the British diplomat Benjamin Bathurst. I want to know what you think about this story. Tell me in the comments, do you believe the official narrative, or do you think something much darker and more sinister happened to him? I'll see you in the comments. As always, make sure you hit that subscribe button on your way out the door so that you're always notified when a new historical story or fact is put up, and I will see you in the next one.